Dawson.
Good morning, my lady. Today's witness is the Right Honourable Nicola Sturgeon, MSP.
Would you like to repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Nicola Sturgeon.
I am.
You've very helpfully provided two statements to this module of the inquiry, as well as a number of other prior statements. The statements you provided to this module are under reference INQ 000-339033. This is a statement dated the 6th of November 2023. Is that your statement?
It is.
Have you signed the statement?
I have.
Do the contents of the statement remain true and accurate as at today's date?
Yes.
You also provided a further statement to us under reference INQ 000-273980. This was a further statement dated the 16th of November 2023. Is that your further statement?
Yes.
Have you signed that?
Yes.
Do the contents of that statement remain true and accurate as at today's date?
Yes, I provided some further information to the inquiry last week, which would usefully be read alongside that statement, but yes.
Thank you. Some additional documentation rather than changing the text of the statement, I think.
Indeed.
Thank you. You were the First Minister of Scotland between the 20th of November 2014 and the 28th of March 2023.
I was.
You held office as First Minister throughout the period from January 2020 to April 2022.
I did.
That is, of course, the period of time with which this module is primarily concerned. As First Minister during that period, you were head of the Scottish Government and so had overall responsibility for Scotland's pandemic response and for engagement with the UK Government and other devolved administrations.
I did.
Could I ask you some questions, please, about the way in which you and others within the Scottish Government used informal methods of communication in order to discuss matters connected to the pandemic? In your statement dated the 16th of November, that's INQ 000-273980, at paragraph 48, you say, "Throughout the pandemic, I sought to be open, transparent and accountable in respect of all decisions being taken, while acknowledging some of the issues presented by the sheer pace and magnitude of what we were facing in early 2020. I set out in my Module 2A statement the high degree of formality around Scottish Government decision-making. Decisions were informed, shaped and taken mainly through deep dive sessions, gold discussions and cabinet meetings. I feel that the nature of the communication that has emerged from the UK Government has created an impression that we were all communicating in such a way. That was not the case, certainly not as far as communications I was party to are concerned. The culture within the Scottish Government during the period in question was serious, formal, purposeful and collegiate. During the pandemic, I did not make extensive use of informal messaging and certainly did not use it to reach decisions. Is it still your position today that you and the Scottish Government were open, transparent and accountable in your actions, not just in your words, at all times throughout the pandemic response in Scotland?
Yes, that is still my position. Openness and transparency with the Scottish public was very important to me from the outset of the pandemic. I communicated to the public on a daily basis for a lengthy period of time. We will not have got every decision right, and we will have made misjudgments, and there will be undoubtedly instances put to me today where, on reflection, I will think that we could have been more transparent than we were. But given the nature of the emergency that we were confronted with, building a relationship of trust with the public was important. And in my view then, and in my view now, that had to be built on a spirit of openness.
Openness and transparency are fundamental concepts in the way in which the Scottish Government seeks to represent the people of Scotland, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
One can see, as we've seen it in a number of documents, more general documents, but also one specifically related to the pandemic response. For example, the National Performance Framework, one sees those concepts repeated, I think, in that document. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And indeed, in documents which we have looked at, which set out the approach which the Scottish Government wished to take to the way in which it was dealing with the challenges of the pandemic, again, one sees the concepts of openness, transparency, accountability at the very core. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as far as a very important role that you played was concerned, the public communications strategy, again, these concepts were very much the bedrock, I think, of the way in which you tried to communicate messages, information, decisions to the public in Scotland.
That is what I sought to do.
You say in the passage we've looked at that you did not use informal communications to reach decisions. What do you mean by that?
Informal communications were not in any sense an extensive or a meaningful part of how I conducted government business in any way, but certainly not to reach decisions. And I would say that in relation not just to COVID, but to government generally. The number of individuals with whom I would have any informal communication through, I'm talking here about text messages or WhatsApp,
yes,
would be very limited. In the case of WhatsApp, probably no more than a handful of people. I was never a member of any WhatsApp groups. And I think the two people that I would have had the most extensive communication with would have been my former Chief of Staff, Liz Lloyd, and Humza Yousaf. I believe the inquiry has some messages between me and those individuals, which I hadn't retained, but they had. And I think they will give a sense of the nature of that communication. The communication of that nature was not used by me for anything other than routine exchanges, logistics, passing on information. The exchanges with the individuals I've referred to will be littered with things like, there's a note coming to you through the system, I'm giving you a heads up about that. That's the nature of the communication. I understand the inquiry may want to explore some elements of that, and I will, of course, answer questions about specifics, but that is the overall nature of that communication, extremely limited. And I operated on the basis that I would ensure that anything in communications of that description were otherwise recorded on the Scottish Government system, if there was anything of that nature.
We've heard others refer to recording salient information on the corporate record. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, so if there were, and this would be rare in my case because of what I've said, I did not do government business through informal messaging in relation to COVID or any other matter. But if there were salient points of substance, I would ask myself, is that recorded in the Scottish Government's record, either because I had put it in or it was referring to something that was already on the record. If somebody was, as I used as an illustration a moment ago, flagging up something that was coming to me through the system. Another example, in my exchanges with Humza Yousaf, he would, for a period when vaccination was such a focus of all of our efforts, he would send me on a daily basis the vaccination uptake figures, which would, within a very short space of time, come to me formally and be published. So I would check whether there was anything that required to be recorded on the Scottish Government system. And I am absolutely firmly of the view that there is nothing, and the inquiry has seen some of these messages, in any informal messaging that I would have been party to that could not have been seen and understood through the formal systems and indeed through the public communications that I was engaging in on a daily basis, where I went through in great detail, some people perhaps thought too much detail sometimes, the issues that we were confronted with and dealing with on a daily basis.
So just to be clear, to reconcile two parts of your evidence there, you said you didn't use these informal messaging systems, but I think you suggested that there would rarely be occasions when you would have to transpose things onto the corporate record, which suggests that you at least rarely use them.
Sorry, just to be very clear, I have not said, and I'm not saying today, that I never used informal means of communication. What I am saying is that I did so very rarely, and not even more rarely to discuss issues of substance or anything that could be described as decision-making. I'm sure we'll come on to the formal ways in which the Scottish Government took decisions later on, but there was a high degree of formality around the decision-making of the Scottish Government.
Thank you. You mentioned a moment ago that there would be routine exchanges undertaken via these media. Do you accept, based on at least the communications we have seen, that you did undertake discussions around what decisions might be taken through these media?
There would be an element of reflecting on the decisions that we were having to make. But I was doing that openly in daily briefings with the public. So I would not be reflecting in any way where I was, I suppose, engaging in some secret course of discussion that I wouldn't be sharing openly during that. So yes, there would be, and I think there have been some exchanges discussed at the inquiry in previous evidence sessions where I am saying about a particular decision, I'm not sure in my own mind, what the right way to go is. But that would be something that I was trying to formulate in my mind before a formal Cabinet discussion where Cabinet would take the decision. That is the extent of that. So other exchanges would literally be, I think in the exchanges between myself and Humza Yousaf, things like Mr. Yousaf saying to me, I've just taken part in a Four Nations call. The note of the readout will be on its way to you. If you want me to give you a call to brief you on that before you get it, I'll do that. So that is the nature of the communication that I would routinely, and I again would say it would be limited, that I would routinely have.
Thank you. We heard evidence, as you may be aware, from one of the Directors General within the Civil Service in Scotland, Ms Leslie Fraser. She was responsible for the compilation of a number of different Scottish Government policies around information and document retention. And she accepted in her evidence that the primary aim of those policies across Scottish Government was to try to make sure that a reasonable amount of information was retained in order to be able to give any interested Scottish citizen the material from which, amongst other things, they could deduce how decisions had been taken. Do you accept that the messages that we have seen from others contain information that an interested Scottish citizen would like to see in order to understand how decisions were taken in the pandemic?
Forgive me, Mr Dawson, if I perhaps haven't seen all of the exchanges.
Of course.
But I am not sure I have seen exchanges that have been discussed at the inquiry where I would accept, and it may be that I'm showing some today where I do have to accept this, but that I would accept that the interested member of the Scottish public couldn't see not just the decisions that were being arrived at in the Scottish Government, but the reasoning and the evidence behind those decisions from the public record. As I've referenced already and is well known, so I won't labour the point, almost every day during the pandemic I would openly share with the public the state of the pandemic, the difficult choices that was posing for the government, what we were considering in reaching these decisions, what it meant for what we were asking the public to do. So there was a very open form of communication, and I'm not sure I have seen anything that I would say the Scottish public just wouldn't have had any idea that we were talking about that or considering that.
It might be a matter for the Scottish public to judge, based on all of the information that was relevant to these matters, whether they felt that they had seen all of the information that they needed to be able to draw conclusions about the appropriateness, timeliness of your decisions.
Of course, let me be absolutely clear, I accept that, and of course it's for the inquiry to judge whether that is the case. Simply sharing my views. But again, and I repeat this because I do think it is significant and material. The means of communication, the method and the frequency of communication that the Scottish Government was engaging in meant that on a daily basis, it was almost an open conversation with the public, which we thought was important to encourage compliance with what the public were being asked to do. So, you know, these are public statements, and the question and answers after it would go through not just the decisions we'd arrived at, but we would go through the considerations, the balances we were trying to strike, the pretty invidious nature of some of the choices that we were all being faced with then.
You referred in the passage from your statement that we went to the fact that it had emerged publicly through the procedures of this inquiry that a lot of this informal communication had been done within the UK government, by WhatsApp in particular, but by other means as well. And you suggested that you felt that the nature of the communication as emerged from the UK government has created an impression that we were all communicating in such a way. We have, fortuitously, by way of example, seen very extensive exchanges between the now First Minister and Professor Leach discussing their attitude to important moments within the pandemic, important decisions they needed to take, important advice they required ultimately to give to you in Cabinet and other fora. It appears from that, and indeed the other messages which have now come to light, that informal messaging, in particular WhatsApp, was a frequent part of the way in which the Scottish Government conducted its business in COVID. Were you unaware of the fact that that was the case as First Minister during the course of the pandemic?
The exchanges you refer to, I would have had no knowledge of and had no sight of before seeing them in the course of this inquiry. If you're asking me, Mr Dawson, did I not know that anybody in the Scottish Government was using WhatsApp? Of course that's not the case. WhatsApp had become, in my view, probably too common a means of communication. But I think the exchanges you're talking about would, certainly from what I have seen, would not suggest that government decisions were being taken through WhatsApp. WhatsApp was a means of communication that people were using to exchange information on occasion, sometimes to share views about things, and using language or rather ways of describing things that perhaps wouldn't have been done in different forms of communication. One of the reasons, and if I thought this before COVID and this inquiry, I certainly think it even more strongly now. One of the reasons why I don't believe that WhatsApp, for example, should be used for government communication and decision making is that, you know, when I make a public statement, or when I made public statements as First Minister in this context, I would think very, very carefully about the words I use to try to minimise as far as is ever possible the scope for what I was saying to be misinterpreted. When people send messages on WhatsApp, they don't think, including me, you don't think that deeply about how you're phrasing things, and therefore messages, when they are looked back at later on, can be open to different interpretations because people haven't really thought about the words they're using or the phraseology that they're using. And I think that certainly would be true of some of the exchanges that the inquiry has been looking at.
Would you, as First Minister, not have thought it to be important that ministers and senior officials would think deeply about the conduct of government business, whether conducted through WhatsApp or otherwise?
Of course, that is the case. And in saying that, I'm not trying to suggest that people were not thinking deeply. The form of, and I think every human being probably can recognise what I'm saying, the form of communication can influence the phraseology or the way in which things are worded. And informal communication, I think, lends itself to very short, sharp exchanges that would be very different if you were making a speech or putting something in a formal paper for decision making. Can I say very clearly, when I was First Minister, I would not have expected any of my ministers or any of my officials to have been conducting substantive government discussions and certainly not taking government decisions through WhatsApp or other informal means of messaging.
Thank you for that. On the 27th of May of 2020, as we covered with Mr Swinney yesterday, in the Scottish Parliament, in response to a question about whether you would order a public inquiry into the Covid-19 outbreak in care homes in Scotland, you replied as follows: "Of course there will be a public inquiry into this whole crisis and every aspect of this crisis, and that will undoubtedly include what happened in care homes." So at that stage, you knew that there would be a public inquiry in the future into the Scottish Government's response to the pandemic generally?
I always assumed there would be a public inquiry.
In fact, of course, as we know, you effectively had the power to order
indeed,
an inquiry,
and
you did.
as it turned out in Scotland, we have more than one inquiry, so yes, I did.
Yes. On the 3rd of August 2021, Leslie Fraser, who I mentioned a moment ago, and another civil servant whom you'll know, Mr Kenneth Thompson, sent a do not destroy email to Scottish Government officials with the subject COVID-19 Independent Inquiry Record Retention, explaining the importance of retaining relevant material to the work of the inquiry. Do you recall receiving that email?
I do not, as far as I am aware, I did not receive that.
You recall, I would imagine in a general sense, that such a notification was sent out?
I would say this, that I don't think I would have required to see that to know that matters that were relevant to matters of substance, salient, relevant to the inquiry should be retained, and that I had a duty, as all ministers and officials would have had a duty, to ensure that anything that they were exchanging in informal messaging, if they were not retaining those messages in line with the policies that were in place, then there would be a clear record of anything on the Scottish Government systems.
You said on the 24th of August 2021 at a COVID media briefing given by you that the Scottish Government had started the process of setting up the Scottish COVID inquiry, which we mentioned a moment ago. You stated, "I believe that a full public inquiry has a very important role to play, both in scrutinising the decisions we took and indeed continue to take in the course of the pandemic, and also in identifying and learning lessons for the future." Do you agree that in order to scrutinise decisions and learn lessons, a public inquiry would need to see not just the decisions themselves, but the discussions that led to the decisions being made or not made, including discussion of information and advice?
Yes, I do agree with that. And what I would add to that, and let me say this is obviously a matter for the inquiry to judge, in terms of any informal communications I had, which, as I have already said, were limited, both in terms of the number of people and the extent of the communication. There would be nothing in those communications that was not available to either the inquiry or the public through the record of the Scottish Government, or indeed in the very detailed public statements that were being made every day. I want to assure the inquiry of that I take and took very seriously the duty that was on the shoulders of me as First Minister and of the Scottish Government collectively to make sure that this inquiry and the corresponding Scottish inquiry would have at its disposal all of the evidence and material that would allow it to assess the decisions and the underpinning reasoning and evidence for those decisions. Over the course of the pandemic, and forgive me if I'm getting ahead of your line of questioning, we will no doubt talk about cabinet papers and minutes. Over the course of the pandemic, I think there would have been in the region of 100 cabinet meetings. For each of those, there would be detailed papers, detailed minutes that would not just record the decisions that cabinet reached, but that would look at the different options we assessed and discussed, that would narrate the evidence and the reasoning behind the decisions we arrived at, and in cabinet minutes would also have lengthy and comprehensive summaries of the points made in the discussion around the cabinet table. Now, obviously that is not all that the inquiry has at its disposal, but if it was all that this inquiry had, that would be a comprehensive and very detailed account of every decision that the Scottish Government took in the course of the pandemic.
As at May, at least, I think you've indicated already, you were fully cognizant of the fact that there would be a public inquiry, yes?
Yes.
And in August 2021, you announced that there would be one.
Yes.
You knew at the time when you made the statement announcing the Scottish COVID inquiry that material which you had used to exchange messages, informal communications, would assist in the very important aims of the inquiry, scrutinising the decisions that you took.
Yes.
And you knew at that point that those messages had been destroyed.
I knew, yes, that I had operated in line with a policy that I had operated in line with, and advice that I had had from the outset of my time as a minister to ensure that conversations with others in government with any impact or relationship to government business shouldn't be kept on a phone that could be lost or stolen, but properly recorded. And I was very cognisant of, and had been from the start of the pandemic, so not just at the points in time that you are referring to, from the start of the pandemic, of my duty to ensure that anything of salience, relevance, substance to the decision-making of the government would be properly recorded through the Scottish Government record.
Thank you. You were asked a question by a journalist from Channel 4 where he asked you at that very press conference in August 2021, Scottish Government has a patchy record of disclosing evidence when asked to do so. Can you guarantee to the bereaved families that you will disclose emails, WhatsApps, private emails, if you've been using them, whatever, that nothing will be off limits to the inquiry? You responded, I think if you understand statutory public inquiries, you would know that even if I wasn't prepared to give that assurance, which for the avoidance of doubt I am, then I wouldn't have the ability. He asked specific questions about informal means of communication, including WhatsApps, but you knew by that stage that your WhatsApps had been destroyed.
But I also knew that anything of any relevance or substance from any of that material would be properly recorded in the Scottish Government system, and indeed would have been communicated in all likelihood by me through the daily media briefings that I gave. The importance in my view, is making sure that the inquiry has at its disposal all of the evidence underpinning the decisions as well as the decisions we were arriving at. I operated from 2007 based on advice, the policy that messages, business relating to government should not be kept on a phone that could be lost or stolen and insecure in that way, but properly recorded through the system. I would want to, again, underline that in my case, that communication was extremely limited, and I do not, would not relate to matters of substantive government decision making.
But that wasn't the question you were asked. You were asked the question as to whether you would disclose emails, WhatsApps, private emails, have been using them, whatever. He didn't ask you the question as to whether the material that was contained within the discussions exchanged by those media was recorded on the corporate record. He asked whether the emails, WhatsApps, private emails, whatever, would be disclosed, and you gave an assurance that they would be.
And I, as will have been the case in many occasions over the course of not just the COVID pandemic, but in my many years in politics, answering questions, when you're answering questions, you're trying to answer the substance of the question, and when you look back at the literal terms of the answer, it can be put to you in that way. So I accept that, and I apologise if that answer was not as clear. But I also want to be very clear and give the inquiry a personal assurance that I am certain that the inquiry has at its disposal anything and everything germane to my decision making during the process and the time period of the pandemic, and the factors underpinning those decisions. That has always been important to me, and it remains important to me, but more importantly than that, it's essential to the scrutiny of the decisions that I will carry the impact of these decisions with me forever, and I want to make sure that those who come after me in politics have the benefit of the learning, the things that my government did right and the things that my government did not that we're not right, or with hindsight that we wish we had done differently. I cannot say strongly enough how important that is to me. These decisions were of a magnitude beyond what I had ever experienced, and that is true of decision makers everywhere, and the impact of them I think about literally every day, and I want this inquiry and the Scottish inquiry to scrutinise those decisions so that we can learn and future governments can learn appropriate lessons from them.
In case there's any doubt on the matter, Ms Sturgeon, when I delivered the opening statement in this module, we were keen to try to make it clear that our position with regard to those decisions was that they were extremely difficult decisions, and I think there can be no doubt about that. As regards your production of documents, however, you did not produce to us any WhatsApps, messages or any other informal communications with your first statement dated the 6th of November 2023, despite the request that you do so.
At the time, for the reasons I have set out, I did not hold WhatsApp messages or text messages at that point, and as I have said, because I had gone through a process of making sure anything of relevance, which would have been very, very limited, I could assure myself would be available through the public record and the Scottish Government record. When I was asked to double check when the inquiry sent another request for a statement, I discovered a isolated text message with one individual, the then Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, which I provided to the inquiry. And I also found, and I apologise to the inquiry because I hadn't at the time thought to look in this place because it would not be a normal means of communication. But when I was racking my brains to see where I could find anything that might be relevant, I looked at the DM function of Twitter and found there some messages with Professor David Schridder and also some very limited messages with Professor Jason Leach, which I then provided to the inquiry. I also sought and was provided through the government with messages between me and Liz Lloyd and Humza Yousaf, which I was aware the inquiry would have from them, but nevertheless, because I then held them, passed them to the inquiry. There is one exchange in the Twitter DM messages with Jason Leach that I think gives an indication of my approach to informal messaging, where he is raising something with me, and I think it is the last message in this exchange. I in terms say to him, if you want to talk about matters like this, come and see me properly. This is not the place to do it. And that was my attitude to that kind of messaging.
So should we take that to be an instruction to Professor Leach that if he wanted to carry out such conversations where he was discussing important matters related to the pandemic with you, you wanted to be clear to him that that was a matter which was not appropriate for these media? It should be done more formally, in person. Discussions was your practice?
Absolutely, and that was, I made it clear to him that that was my practice. I think the exchange was related to hospital capacity and ventilation facilities in hospitals at a relatively early stage of the pandemic.
Yes. Of course, Professor Leach, we know, conducted extensive discussions related to important decisions in the pandemic with others, including the current First Minister. As
I know you will appreciate, I have only seen exchanges that have been explored at previous evidence sessions, so I cannot talk in any way about the totality of those messages. Yes. I have not seen, to the best of my knowledge, anything that would suggest he was engaging in decision-making. There are exchanges, conversational exchanges. Many of these exchanges that I have seen, and from other governments as well, I think on WhatsApp would be the kind of exchange that, had people not been working remotely and been in the same building as I actually was with key advisors throughout the pandemic, these are the kind of conversations that would have happened verbally, face to face, and end up being translated to WhatsApp because of the nature of people's working environments.
given the fact that you were in St Andrew's House, I think, quite a lot of the time, as we heard from Ms Freeman, as she was, there were a large number of those verbal conversations between you and others, like Ms Freeman, who are based predominantly there during the pandemic. Isn't that right?
Yes, I mean, the majority of the conversations that I would be having with certainly Ms Freeman and the Chief Medical Officer at the time, and other senior advisors, would be face-to-face in St Andrew's House. I was in St Andrew's House from very early in the morning till very late at night, almost every day for an extended period of time, as were these other individuals.
I think Ms Freeman did say 7 days a week your role there,
for
pretty
a
much.
period, 7 days a week, yes.
Yes. Were the salient points of those verbal discussions committed to the corporate record?
Yeah, so at my private office were also, not my entire private office, but key individuals in my private office, and they would have a rota. There would be somebody from my private office in the building with me. So salient points would be recorded as appropriate and fed through the system. I think perhaps, if I may, there's two further points to be made there. If I, as First Minister, am having a discussion with anybody that then requires action to be taken, if that's not inputted to the system, action won't be taken. That is how conversations turn into actions that are necessary. The second point is just to reflect, particularly in the very early stages of the pandemic and in the early stages of, well, certainly through March and into April 2020, there was a frenetic pace of decision making, and we were taking decisions at very short notice. The situation was changing several times a day, and we were all working at pace. I would have conversations in the morning that by the afternoon the situation had changed, and so the nature of those conversations would be different. And I think it's 3-4 years on, it is difficult sometimes to appreciate just how frenetic the pace of activity was at that time.
The fact that you're working at pace, though, doesn't alter the obligation to make sure that salient points of conversations and messaging are on the corporate record.
Oh no, absolutely. But for example, I remember on the 23rd of March 2020, the day that we entered what became known as lockdown, having conversations because the advice that was coming at that point was that we required very strict measures to suppress the virus at that stage. The measures that had been introduced previously weren't bringing the R number down sufficiently. I remember having conversations with Ms Freeman, the Chief Medical Officer at the time. We then, of course, went into COBRA, and those decisions were formalised through the COBRA meeting, and they'd be recorded that way. So I suppose what I'm saying is the ways in which these conversations would become decisions and then be recorded was perhaps different in the environment we were in at that point than would be the case in normal times and normal government business.
Whereas with these verbal conversations, it wouldn't be possible for us to work out whether the salient points of those had been transcribed to the corporate record, because although we might have the corporate record, we don't know what the conversations were. In contradistinction, we do now have some messages, so we could compare the corporate record to those messages and work out for ourselves whether the salient points had been transcribed.
I am absolutely sure that you would be able to take messages and go to the corporate record, go to the public statements that were made at the time and see all of that reflected. It may not be the case that in every instance you will see, conversation between on this date and the reference on the corporate record tying those up, absolutely. But I am absolutely certain that the salient points that we were discussing then would be reflected on the corporate and indeed on the public record. These were, by their very nature, these were decisions that could not be kept secret, even if we had wanted to, which we didn't, because these were decisions that were asking the public to do things, or more regularly not to do things, that had to be communicated. They were also decisions that had very significant impacts for the private sector, for the public sector, for society as a whole. They had to be recorded in a way that they could be actioned and communicated clearly, quickly and effectively.
That may apply to the decisions themselves, that they couldn't be kept secret because also ultimately the public found out about them, the restrictions and everything. However, the discussions relating to the decisions and how they had been reached could, it would appear, be kept secret.
Well, I would like to give an assurance to the inquiry that contrary to there being any desire on the part of me or my government to keep things secret, I would suggest that the opposite was the case during the pandemic. We went to great lengths to communicate not just the decisions. I took a view very early on in the pandemic, it's for others to judge whether it was right or wrong, that if we were to achieve a level of compliance with the restrictions that we were placing the country under, then it was important that the public didn't just know what we were asking them to do, but why we were asking them to do it, and what the reasoning was that had taken us to those decisions. And that's what I sought to do, sometimes effectively, perhaps sometimes not so effectively, on a daily basis. So we were not having discussions that weren't then being communicated to the public openly. In the nature of not just government, but life generally, it is not possible to record, and I'm not even sure it's desirable to good governance, if I may say that, to record every single word that is uttered in a conversation in government. There needs to be, in government, and I think this is in the interest of good governance, the ability for ministers with each other or ministers with advisors to have an open, thinking out loud discussion before getting to the point of a proposal, let alone a decision. But salient points about why we were taking decisions and what those decisions were, absolutely. To go back to, I think, the question you initially put to me, Mr Dawson, absolutely. I firmly am of the view that they will all be discernible from the corporate government record and indeed over and above that, the public record.
We subsequently learned from your second statement that you had used various informal means of communication for some messaging with Mr Youssef, Ms Lloyd, Mr Swinney, Ms Freeman, Dr Calderwood, Dr Smith, Professor Leach, Ken Thompson, Leslie Evans, Professor Sridhar, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, and the former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill. Is that correct?
Yes.
You produced no messages with any of these individuals with your first statement. Is that correct? Yes,
but as I also say in the statement, those messages would have been extremely limited. If I take John Swinney, for example, it has never been our practice, not just during the pandemic, but generally to text. I don't think I've ever WhatsApped John Swinney, and certainly if I have, it would be the exception, absolutely the exception. But text messages would be very occasional, and the nature of the text messages that I would have with John Swinney would be, are you free to speak? Or can I pop in to see you? It's just never been in the nature of it. With some of the others, Catherine Calderwood was one of those who was in St Andrew's House with me. The number of people in the Scottish Government, however many thousands of people work in the Scottish Government that I hold a mobile phone number for, is extremely limited. It was not my method of communication with Mark Drakeford and Michelle O'Neill. These are discussions with other government leaders that would have been recorded through the normal systems. So I, again, want to be very clear that it was not my practice to not just not take decisions through informal messaging, but have substantial or lengthy or detailed discussions about government decisions through these means. It's not my style, it's not my practice, it's never been my practice, not least because I don't think it is a good or effective or helpful way of reaching decisions, not just taking decisions, but it's not a helpful process in reaching decisions either.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Youssef and Ms Lloyd were produced by you with your second statement. Where did you get them?
They were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
You obviously didn't have those on your own devices because you deleted them, hadn't you?
I didn't retain them in line with the procedure I've already talked about.
Are you creating a distinction between deletion and not retain?
No.
You had deleted them, had you not?
I think deletion, I think, forgive me, I think sounds as if it was a sort of, not bothering to check whether any information was being retained. I was very thorough, and not just in the pandemic, but in all my work in government, to ensure that things were appropriately recorded, but in line with the advice I'd always been given since my first day in government probably was not to retain conversations like that on a phone that could be lost or stolen and therefore not secure.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
And as far as the other messages are concerned that you couldn't produce yourself between you and all these others, you deleted all of those as well?
In the manner that and after the process that I have set out, yes.
You also produced some direct Twitter messages that you've already mentioned with Professor Leach and Professor Sridhar. Professor Sridhar also produced those messages to us, although slightly later than you, at the beginning of December. Did you have any discussions with her about the production of those messages?
I think I let her know that I'd found messages and would be providing them to the inquiry.
So there was contact between you and her related to the messages?
I simply, as a courtesy, to let her know, yes.
Could I have a look, please, at INQ 000287766? We're both being admonished, I think, Ms Sturgeon, for speaking too quickly for the stenographer. So if we can both try and speak a little more slowly, that would be very much appreciated. These are some extracts from messages between yourself and Ms Lloyd. I'm starting with the one on the 27th of October 2020, 7:10. So just reading through them, it says, I'm having a bit of a crisis, this is you speaking, I'm having a bit of a crisis of decision-making in hospitality, not helped by the fact I haven't slept. The public health argument says stick with 6 PM/NO alcohol, no alcohol for level 3, but I suspect industry will go mad, and I worry we could derail debate, though I suspect that won't happen, and we could commit to listening and changing if we felt necessary. To which Ms Lloyd replies, my instinct is 6 PM. That's the same as Central Belt now, but some more places open. They have offered further mitigation, so we work with them on delivering those extra mitigations and review at that point. She then follows up, the only alternative would be 8 PM, but no alcohol. Restaurants would like you for that. To which you say it's the same as non-Central Belt. Places can open, but only for food, non-alcohol. 8 PM would be better. I guess, but not sure we can make much of a public health argument for 8 PM alcohol at level 2 and 8 PM no alcohol at level 3. Ms Lloyd replies, that's why I would stick with 6 PM, but if you want to compromise, it would be about giving people regulated places to be in the winter rather than unregulated homes. But no alcohol because it changes behaviour. The difference from now would basically be it's colder and it's darker, so people will be less likely to be outside. You say, OK, we should stick with 6. It's also random, but I think we need to be prepared for a bit of backlash. I've also queried whether we really need the last entry times, and if we do, if we should give on 9:30/10:30. As it stands, there's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry. Ms Lloyd replies, level 2, 8 PM is listening to them. And then she follows up, and the whole allowing restaurants and pubs to stay open, you say, I suppose, and then she says, there's quite a lot recently. I mean, they'll still be grumpy, but there it is, I think it's meant to say. This is an example of a messaging exchange that would be relevant to someone who would be interested in knowing how decisions in this regard had been arrived at.
Yes, but I, in many respects, I think this exchange illustrates the answers I've been giving you for context, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think this is 7:20 on the morning of the 27th of October 2020. I think I was on my way to a cabinet meeting. I would be in the car from Glasgow. These would be decisions that cabinet was about to arrive at, and I am simply talking about the things that I would then go into Cabinet and we would talk about, and then would be recorded through the Cabinet minutes and the decisions that we took. I was probably later that day standing on a public platform talking about some of the decisions that we'd faced, the options that we had, and why we had arrived at the decision that we have arrived at. I can't see it right now, there's a reference in there to "I have queried." That's a reference, that's something I had obviously fed in as a question to the advisors who would have been preparing the cabinet minute papers. So in a sense, I look at this and I don't consider that there is anything in that wouldn't be reflected through the decision making and the evidence of the decision-making of the government, and undoubtedly hospitality and the impact of hospitality, the different time limits, that was all very, very much to the fore in public discussion at the time. And I am certain that I would have been talking openly about some of these choices and the fine balances of the very difficult decisions that we were having to take.
Will we find on the corporate record or some other public record that your position was we should probably stick with 6? It's all so random. That's
the message exchange Mr Dawson starts with. And again, I said earlier on, the reason I don't think WhatsApp messages should be used to have substantial government discussions is because we can look at them almost 4 years later and they're open to different interpretations. That message exchange that you read out started with me, perhaps this is the kind of thing I would prefer not to be on the public record, having a crisis of decision making. It, perhaps is not what I wanted people to know, and that I hadn't slept. At the 27th of October 2020, wouldn't have had a day off since much earlier that year, before March. And had been working. I'm not saying that for sympathy. That was my job and my duty. And there were moments in that where the decisions that we were taking felt almost impossible. That whatever we did, we would cause difficulty and harm to somebody somewhere. And so a phrase like "it's all so random," that probably simply reflects how I felt at 7:20 that morning when I hadn't had much sleep. But by the time I got to Cabinet, I'm sure that I would have collected my thoughts and that we then had a proper discussion and reached a decision that was properly recorded with a good and robust process around it.
This is a discussion related to an important decision made during the course of the management of the pandemic.
That would have then been discussed at Cabinet and recorded through, you've seen all the minutes of the Cabinet, but the minutes of all Cabinet meetings, they don't just record the decision we arrive at. They will record if there's a paper given different options, they will record that, and they record a summary, a précis of the discussion and the points made in these discussions.
Does that record record that your position was, as it stands, there's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry? I would so I don't have the Cabinet minute from that date in front of me, but I absolutely am certain that around this point in particular, I will have spoken not just in Cabinet meetings, but publicly about the need to listen to industry, to listen to different groups in Scottish society as we arrived at the decisions. We were trying to take decisions that none of us wanted to be taking, and we were trying to reach those decisions in a way that we thought struck the right balance. I'm sure we'll come on to talk later on about the 4 harms approach that the Scottish Government took. And in that, we were listening as much as we could to different viewpoints. We were not always able to take account of those viewpoints because of the nature of the decisions. So, I am absolutely certain that it would have been not news to anybody that we were struggling with the impact on industry of some of these decisions, and that we were at pains to show that we, as far as we could, given the nature of the decisions that we were taking, we were listening to reasonable points that were being made. do you think that an interested member of Scottish society, or indeed this inquiry, should take no interest at all in the process by which this decision is made and this discussion's role in it, including the fact that you say it's also random? There's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry. Ms Lloyd's response, Ms Lloyd's involvement in the discussion, either generally or in relation to this specific issue.
Oh, no, I am not saying the inquiry should have no interest in that. On the contrary, I think the inquiry does have an interest in this, and I think the wider Scottish public would. What I am saying is I do not accept that it would have been unknown to the public at the time that these were the issues we were grappling with. Every day I was taking the public through the different issues that we were grappling with, the balances we were trying to strike, the trade-offs that we were having to make, and the different viewpoints that we were trying as best we could to balance. So, you know, in a sense, this is an example of an exchange that, you know, we look at it now in a WhatsApp, but I don't consider that there is anything in that exchange that would not have been known, that was either on the record and through the Cabinet minutes or in public statements, that these were exactly the kind of issues we were trying to reach considered and balanced judgments on.
Thank you. Could I take you to another document, please? This is INQ 000268017. This is another exchange. This is not a group that features you, but it's another piece of evidence that we've seen. And I'd be interested in understanding your reflection on some of the content of the exchange. This is in your capacity as the former First Minister and First Minister at the time. This is in a WhatsApp group chat called Covid Outbreak Group. These messages were provided to the inquiry by Dr. Jim McMenamin of Public Health Scotland, who did not delete his messages, and not by the Scottish Government or its officials. In the exchange at 27th of August 2020, you'll recognise, no doubt, the individuals involved. Ken Thompson says, just to remind you seriously, this is discoverable under FOI. Know where the clear chat button is, to which Nicola Steadman replies, yes, absolutely. Jason Leach points out DG level input there. Mr. Thompson says, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now clear it again. Jason Leach says, done. Nicola Steadman, me too. And someone called Donna Bell and me. Were you aware in your capacity as First Minister that these sort of exchanges took place and that a senior member of the civil service considered plausible deniability to be his middle name?
As you said at the outset of the question, I was not a member of this group until some of these exchanges were explored in evidence sessions last week. I had never seen these messages before. Did I know that there would be WhatsApp groups where officials were exchanging information? I'm not sure I was particularly conscious of it, but I would have, had I been asked to stop and consider that, I would have said, well, I would assume so, given the nature of how people we're working. I would absolutely expect all officials in the Scottish Government to retain, in line with Scottish Government policies, information relevant to our decision making. I look at that exchange and what I don't see is an exchange about the decisions we're taking. I see a light-hearted discussion between officials. Ken Thompson, I know, has been before you and has given his interpretation of that, so he can answer and has answered for himself. I would read that as him reminding people of the need to be professional on WhatsApp, even when discussing light-hearted things. The other thing I would say about all of these individuals on the screen before me is that they are all, in my knowledge and experience, and with some of them, particularly Ken Thompson, this is extensive experience. They are public servants of the utmost integrity. And at this point and throughout the pandemic, they were public servants who were working in a committed and a dedicated fashion in terms of the hours, and they were working the pressure under which they were working above and beyond probably the call of duty. Ken Thompson is somebody I've worked with throughout my time in the Scottish Government, and he is a civil servant, as I say, of the utmost integrity and the utmost professionalism.
This group was called Covid Outbreak Group, obviously connected to the COVID pandemic, yes?
If that is what you're telling me, yes.
One assumes, yes, that is the name of it. One assumes, therefore, it's to do with COVID outbreak group, to do with COVID, and therefore relevant to the pandemic. What Mr Thompson does here is that, despite recognising that material in this chat is discoverable under freedom of information legislation, is to tell other individuals in the group that they should clear it or delete it. Is that not correct?
That is what is in front of me, yes.
Could I just go a little bit further down, please? I'm just tracing the messages down to 1617, so very shortly after the exchange that we've had there. At 1617, so this is just a couple of minutes after. Further down, you can see in the background other what happens in between. There is something which Jason Leach says at 1617 which is redacted, and then Ken Thompson says the information you requested is not held centrally. Is that a phrase you recognise?
Of course it is, yes.
Is that a phrase which often appears in freedom of information requests when documentation is requested from the Scottish Government?
Yes.
Is it a phrase which indicates, as a result of a request, the Scottish Government is not in a position to be able to provide the information it might otherwise because it doesn't actually hold the information in its central repository?
Yes.
Does it look to you that this is Ken Thompson suggesting that that response is an excuse often trotted out by the Scottish Government in response to freedom of information requests?
I absolutely accept that as an interpretation that can be put on it. These are not my words.
Of course.
This is not an exchange I'm involved in, so there is a limit to how far I can go in trying to interpret what he meant by that. In looking at the exchange, my interpretation of it, which may or may not be correct, is that he is reminding the others on the in the chat that the kind of things they are talking about, they probably shouldn't be on a chat like this. You know, somebody says, I was a nippy teenager in 1986, for example. That's the nature of that. Again, all I can repeat about Ken Thompson is that he is a civil servant, in my experience, who took the responsibilities around recording and making sure that the government record was complete extremely seriously. He's one of the civil servants in my experience that was not just most experienced in that, but that was most assiduous in that side of things. So I can't answer for him. I can speak about my experience of him, and I can give an interpretation based on the context of that was meant to be a light-hearted comment, but that is only my interpretation. Forgive me, the other thing I would say, like many people, given, and I can reflect back to this time, our discussions in government were very serious. There are times when they were extremely sombre. There were days when they were very, very dark, given the nature of what we were dealing with. And because the public as a whole were going through unimaginable trauma at the time, many of them still living with that trauma, reading now light-hearted exchanges, I think, can be very difficult because it gives an impression that people were not taking the situation seriously. That could not be further from the truth. I think what you have there are public servants who were working incredibly hard to take the best decisions, to support ministers to take the best decisions to keep people safe, who were, you know, perhaps, as is human nature, occasionally engaging in light-hearted comment to try to probably get themselves through the day. That's my interpretation of what's before me, but I appreciate others may arrive at a different one.
If it were ultimately to be determined that there was a culture of plausible deniability, a culture of deleting messages that would be recoverable under FOI requests, a culture of suggesting, in order to get out of FOI requests, that documents are not held centrally, these would be abhorrent revelations, would they not?
Absolutely, and to be very clear, that is not the culture that I believe existed in the Scottish Government during my time as First Minister, or indeed in my time as Deputy First Minister.
And if those things were deemed to be the reality of your time, the culture in your time as First Minister, that would be a serious breach of the bond of trust between the government and the Scottish public, which we discussed as being very much at the cornerstone of your whole approach.
If that was the case, and let me
Yes.
repeat, it is not my view that it was, then yes, what you're putting to me would be true. I would, again, and you will take me through, no doubt, lots of documentation later, but that single page, and I'm sure there will be other pages of WhatsApp messages that you could put in front of me, I would counterpose to the, in the region of 100 cabinet papers and minutes that properly, seriously recorded the decision-making and the underpinning rationale for the decision-making of the government. The bond of trust between any government and the public at any time is of paramount importance, but this was particularly the case during the extraordinary and unprecedented situation we faced in the pandemic, and it was something I felt to my core every single day of that.
We saw in messages that we looked at in some detail with Professor Sridhar that you had suggested to her that she might contact you via either your SNP email address or your government email address. Was the suggestion that she might use your SNP email address an appropriate thing to have done in the conduct of your government business?
In reflection, perhaps I shouldn't have done that, but if I had been trying to direct her to a personal email, SNP or otherwise, to keep something off the government system, then I would suggest I wouldn't also have given her my government email address. I wasn't, and obviously the inquiry has looked at that message, I wasn't pushing her in one direction or the other. What I was saying this was, I think from memory, in June 2020 or thereabouts, still a very, very tough, critical phase of the pandemic. Effectively, what I was saying to her is, if there are things you think I should know, don't stand on ceremony. I'd rather know. And at that point, I was, as I think any responsible decision maker should have been, I was trying to deepen my knowledge. I was trying to learn as much as I could about the virus and how to combat the virus. I was desperate to understand different perspectives. I was desperate to understand as much as I could from the experiences and the responses of other countries. Now, let me be very clear, the bulk of that was coming to me through Scottish Government advisors. But I had a thirst to understand as much as possible, and I simply wanted her. She was somebody who had been appearing in the media a lot. I was periodically asked about views that she had been expressing in the media, and I wanted to have an understanding, a deeper understanding of what they were. But if I'd been in any way trying to direct her to a private email address, I doubt if I would have put my government email address in there as well. And of course, the context of what we were talking about was, I think, a paper that she was sharing with the wider advisory group. At no point did Professor Sridhar send me anything that was, for my eyes only, that wasn't either publicly available information or information that was being shared with the advisory group she was a member of.
I think we have seen some emails now that were very recently produced to us by the Scottish Government between yourself and Professor Sridhar, which do, I think, as the direct message exchanges suggest, indicate that she was forwarding on to you policy papers, which I think your position is that those would otherwise have been made available to you. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yes, these were, she was a member, and I know the inquiry is aware of this, she was a member of the Scottish Government
group, yeah.
Covid-19 advisory group, and these were papers she was preparing for the group. What the group did with them, or what weight it gave to them, that would be for the group to answer, but these were not things that she was preparing for me and sending to me alone. They were simply copies of things that were in wider circulation.
It would, one assumes, be in accordance with the normal practice of the group, that the group would decide whether that needed to be sent to you rather than Professor Sridhar, isn't that right?
Possibly, yes, but at that point, and if this was the wrong approach to take, Mr Dawson, I apologise. At that point, in dealing with an unprecedented situation and a pandemic, I wanted to understand as much as I could. I wanted my decisions to be as informed as possible. I read, perhaps one of the reasons why in the early exchange I was saying I hadn't slept much, I read extensively from public sources of articles and research studies online. I was trying to understand as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And I took the view, if somebody could help me with that, if somebody could send me something that I would otherwise see, but I might see. I'm not even sure, with my apologies to her, that I would have necessarily read everything she sent me, because I might already have seen it, or I would perhaps not think it was particularly relevant. But I had a desire to have as much information in order to deepen my understanding of the situation we were facing as I could. And while there are things we may talk about today where I think if I was to go back and have my time again, I would take a different decision, I hope I wouldn't take a different decision on that. It was important to me to be as informed and as educated as I possibly could be.
You used a personal phone for the conduct of government business while First Minister, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And you never used a government-issued phone, is that right? We've heard evidence from a variety of ministers that they seem to use phones from a variety of different sources, some Scottish Government, some personal, some Scottish Parliament-issued phones. Is it appropriate, in your view as the former First Minister, that ministers are conducting business on phones that are not government-issued phones?
It was never suggested to me at any time during my period as First Minister that it was not appropriate. The reason I used a personal phone was that I didn't want to have multiple devices. A government phone, I wouldn't have been able to do constituency business or party or personal matters, and on a constituency one I can do the other. So you get the picture here. Yes. So I wanted to have one device. It was never suggested to me that was inappropriate, and I don't believe it was inappropriate. I think any phone, whether it is personal, Parliament, government, is vulnerable to being left on a train or lost somehow, which goes back to points I made earlier on about the practice and the policy around how information is retained in government.
We've been made aware of an article which appeared in the press just yesterday suggesting that your expenses claims indicated that on the 19th of March you purchased a phone and a number of SIM top-ups. And the article also suggests that you purchased a second prepaid phone in between 2020 and 2021 because it's based on your expenses claims, I think, and the amounts are there. Why did you purchase those phones, and why did you?
They were purchased certainly through my expenses on my authority. I didn't personally purchase them. They were also not for use by me. Many MSPs, I believe, did the same when the pandemic started, and my constituency office staff could no longer work.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Sergeant. Just to be clear, we're obviously keen on understanding whether they were used for your business related to the COVID pandemic in the conduct of your role as First Minister.
They were not used
if they're used for some other purpose, we have no interest.
They were the phones that my constituency office landline were diverted to in the homes of my constituency office staff. I have never, to the best of my knowledge, seen, held and certainly not used any of these phones.
Thank you for clarifying that. My lady, as I'm about to move on to a different topic, if that's an appropriate moment.
Certainly. I suspect we may be getting messages that the stenographer is struggling. I appreciate it's very difficult to change one's pattern of speech, but maybe if you paused before asking the next question, Mr. Dawson, so the stenographer can catch up.
I'll try my very best, my lady, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
11:30. Wilson.
Thank you, lady. Ms Sturgeon, we're moving on to a topic which you have anticipated I wish to ask you some questions about, which is the decision-making processes within Scottish Government during the course of the pandemic. We've heard a number of other witnesses give us some evidence about the various structures that were involved in and around decision-making. It is the case, is it not, that the Scottish Cabinet is meant to be the main decision-making forum within the Scottish Government?
The Scottish Cabinet is the main decision-making forum within the Scottish Government.
Where important decisions are concentrated in the hands of a few people as opposed to the whole Cabinet, the proper function of the Cabinet would be usurped. Isn't that correct?
If that had been the situation, that would be true, but that is not the situation. And indeed, I am absolutely firmly of the view that any reading of the Cabinet papers and the minutes of Cabinet meetings would make very clear that that was not the case. The Cabinet was where our substantive discussions happened and decisions were taken after full and frank discussion involving all of the members of the Cabinet.
Thank you. Could I go to INQ 000334792, please? This is an exchange that we've been to before, Ms Sturgeon, and I think you should have seen it already. I wasn't planning on reading it all out, but it is an exchange between the now First Minister, then Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, and Professor Leach from December 2021, in which he is describing, against a background of a discussion between them, about the possibility that at that time there might require to be further measures taken to stem the Omicron wave, which had just hit Scotland. Is that broad context in terms of where we were in the pandemic correct?
Looking at the date there, then that's exactly where we were. Yes.
Thank you. So they had been discussing that, and Mr Youssef said that he took a hell of a bullet at Cabinet, but might be able to strengthen the measures, even if just slightly. We think we can find £100 million within the portfolio. And then there is a discussion where he again says, don't know if it'll happen the last minute, and FM not remotely happy it's at this last stage, but let's see if it strengthens a package of measures that are far too weak as things stand. Professor Leach says, I was listening, I almost intervened to deflect for you. She was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And he agrees with the principle. Mr Youssef says, that's just the way it is. Her ranting at me isn't the problem. I can take it, it's whether the quantum at this stage helps us strengthen the package, I think it's meant to mean. Though feel free to defend me at a later stage. Today's numbers lower than expected. Suspect some people are not testing given Christmas round the corner. So this is an exchange in which they are discussing a Cabinet meeting. The reference to she is you, I think.
I assume so.
Yes. Do you recall this period just broadly, and we'll get into some of the details?
I recall the period not just broadly, I recall it in detail. I recall the Cabinet meeting in detail too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I think what the context is, if I understand it from the evidence that we've heard from Mr Youssef and indeed Ms Forbes, is that there were discussions around the possibility of having further measures, but there were issues pertaining to whether or not there would be funding to support business if there were a further lockdown or further restrictions. And that at the Cabinet meeting, Mr Youssef, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, had suggested somewhat out of the blue, I think Ms Forbes told us, that he, despite efforts made to try to find funding to assist for that purpose, he had managed to find within his budget £100 million, which wasn't previously known about. Is that correct? Please correct me if I've got that wrong.
I think it's broadly correct. If I may, I can go into
what I'm really interested in is the possibility, is the suggestion that I'll make to you, that this is indicative of a culture in which you did not take kindly to people bringing up at Cabinet meetings things that you had not already had brought to your attention and on which you had not already made a decision.
No, that is absolutely not the case. There was no such culture within the government I led. I think, if I may, in order to answer that question properly, I need to set out the circumstances of that Cabinet meeting. I had, in advance of that Cabinet meeting, asked Ms Forbes, as the Finance Secretary, to undertake an exercise across government to ascertain, we were finding it difficult with the UK government in the financial discussions at that point, to ascertain if there was money we could redirect, free up, make available from within the Scottish Government budget to give additional support to businesses should we require to impose additional restrictions. Ms Forbes had done that exercise. She had done it rigorously and robustly, and she had reported at Cabinet that the outcome of this, having gone round all of the portfolios, was that there wasn't really any money of any significant scale to have. At which point, Mr Youssef, and let me say, Mr Youssef was doing this for the best of intentions, I'm not questioning his motives, said, well, actually, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, I can make £100 million available. In that moment, I felt he was doing a real disservice to the Finance Secretary, because she had just reported that she had done a job and it had resulted in no money being available, and then he seemed to take the feet from her in that I supported and believe is important that there were robust discussions around the Cabinet table. There were robust discussions around the Cabinet table, but I expected all my ministers to operate on a basis of mutual respect and of making sure that they were operating collegiately. And in that moment, I didn't think that was the case, and I was not particularly happy about it. I have to concede that. I think that was probably exacerbated by the fact that, and I can't recall the date, you perhaps will be able to show it to me. I think sometime maybe a couple of weeks before that, Mr Yousaf had indicated to me on WhatsApp that he might be able to find some money in this order. And my response to him was, speak to Kate. And at that meeting, it appeared that he hadn't done so. So that was the context. And I perhaps was also sceptical given the pressures on the National Health Service at that point, that it would be sensible to take £100 million from dealing with the acute pressures on the health service to fund business support, but that is more of a substantive issue. So that is the context of that. As First Minister, I make no apology for this. I always tried to lead from the front. I always took the buck stops with me attitude. I always took Cabinet meetings extremely seriously, made sure I was briefed and had done all the preparation and reading, and I expected similar from my Cabinet Secretaries, and I think that is how good government should work. So that's the context of that. That was not a regular occurrence at Cabinet. It was a very particular set of circumstances that as it happens, I'm not sure that exchange doesn't slightly overstate it, but I do concede that I expressed some displeasure at the process by which the offer had come to the table. And it was more on behalf of Ms Forbes, because I thought it did a disservice to her and the very professional job that she had done.
But we've heard Ms Forbes on this very subject, so we know what her position in that regard is. Do these messages show, Ms Sturgeon, that whilst Cabinet Secretaries might complain in private, as in these as we've just seen, they would ultimately be expected to fall back in line behind your view on matters? No, absolutely not. I suspect in every government everywhere across the world, and I would imagine that the Scottish Government was no different, that ministers will, moan about the First Minister or the Prime Minister to each other. Maybe I used to do it in a previous job in the Scottish Government as well. So that is normal. But I expected Cabinet discussions, and Cabinet discussions were full, robust, detailed. I expected all Cabinet Secretaries to come to those discussions able to argue their point, put their point of view across, and then for us to come to a position at the end of that. That's how Cabinet government works. It was absolutely not the case. And I've referenced Cabinet minutes before, and you have seen all the Cabinet minutes in relation to COVID, but this would be true of Cabinet minutes generally. There is usually, 2-3 pages in a Cabinet minute that in detail summarises the discussion, the points that were raised. It doesn't attribute those points to individuals. That's not how Cabinets are minuted, but it goes into detail about the points raised. So you can look across all of these minutes and see the nature and the detail of the discussion that has been had. And that is how I operated within government, and it's how I would have expected all my Cabinet Secretaries to operate. You can't see these views in the Cabinet minutes? Possibly not, but that I think certainly not. You would see, for example, the discussion about money. You would see the discussion about the fact that there had been an exercise to try to find additional resources. Could I ask you to go, please, to INQ 0002147434, please? Bottom of page 6. If we just go to the first page, please, can we do that? Just to see what it is. These are conclusions, as we've come to understand. They're called minutes of the Cabinet meeting held on the 22nd of June 2021. Does that be correct? Yes. And if we could go to page 7, please. just again to try to contextualise this, our understanding is that this is around the time either at or shortly before cases started to rise again as a result of the Delta wave hitting Scotland. Would that be broadly your recollection?
Of that time period, yes.
Thank you. I'm looking at the decisions taken under subparagraph P and Q, maybe over the P. Yes, thank you. These are the matters decided by Cabinet. It says, for the purposes of Covid-19 decision-making during the summer recess, to delegate to the First Minister decisions that were broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable, noting that the First Minister will be supported as required by the gold group structure of key ministers, including Mr Swinney, Mr Youssef, Ms Forbes and any other ministers with an interest with input from, name redacted, chief advisors and senior lead officials. And under Q, over the page, in the event that the First Minister and Gold Group were to reach a decision that differed materially from the strategic framework, that Cabinet should be advised through correspondence, and if the First Minister requested it at a meeting of the Cabinet, which she could convene at any time, should circumstances require. Is the reference there to the Gold Group, a group which is sometimes called Gold or Gold Command?
It is indeed, and it's an example, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, of the civil service often attaching names, grand names,
yes,
to meetings that are otherwise routine.
Yes. Our understanding, Ms Sturgeon, is that this was a group which, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but our understanding is that it was a group which tended to meet. It didn't always have the same people in it. It was almost certainly always you. I think it was always you. But it would tend to meet in the days before a Cabinet meeting, which would, if regularly scheduled, would take place on a Tuesday. Is that right? So sometimes over the weekend, for example, I think we see.
Yes, so Cabinets routinely met on a Tuesday. I'm sure there were periods during COVID when we met on other days, but yes, routinely a Tuesday. The Gold Group, which was a name I didn't ascribe to it came to be known as that, was initially an opportunity for me and for other ministers as appropriate to interrogate the data, to ask questions of advisers, and before we even got to the point of shaping the proposals that would go to Cabinet for decision, to start to in our own minds firm up the direction we thought we were going in. I should be very clear that the Gold Group, Gold Command, whatever terminology we want to use, was not a decision-making or a formal governance body. The Gold Group would not have reached a decision, and actually I think the rest of that paragraph makes that quite clear, that had the Gold Group wanted to propose a decision, that would have had to have gone through a proper Cabinet process. And just to be clear, Cabinet correspondence, I think in the UK Government as well as the Scottish Government, it's not the preferred way of reaching Cabinet decisions, but it is a way in which Cabinet decisions can be reached short of a meeting. I don't think that happened in this case, but so that paragraph there makes very clear that the previous paragraph, which is not before me right now.
If we just put the previous one back up, please. Thank you.
Again, it is, it's making, so this was in the summer of 2021. People are aware of how far into the pandemic that was. I suspect this was an attempt to give ministers some time off over the summer period. Everybody had obviously been working in some periods round the clock on this, but it's very clear that I am not being given through a delegation a carte blanche to take decisions I want to take. It is talking there about any decisions that are broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable. So we had already set out at that point the milestones that we wanted to reach, and as sometimes was the case, Cabinet would delegate to me. So Cabinet would say, we want to do this, assuming the data on such and such a date supports it. And when we got that data, I would make a judgment, well, does the data support it? And so formally, I would have delegated power to make the final decision. But the process of decision-making was through Cabinet, and I think that makes that clear.
But might I suggest to you, Ms Sturgeon, that contrary to your interpretation, this in fact gives you an incredibly wide discretion as to what you might wish to do in the management of the pandemic, saying that all you need to do is to make decisions, and it is making decisions, which were broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable. That would mean you could do virtually anything.
With respect, I I would challenge that and say that that is not the case. The strategic framework, by its nature, strategic frameworks are broad and high level, but the timetable was very detailed. To depart from that, I would not have had latitude to depart from that. Departing from that would have required me to go through a decision-making process, and I did not have carte blanche, wide latitude to take decisions, and nor should I have had, incidentally, nor would I have wanted to, given the seriousness of what we were dealing with. I'm not sure anybody would have chosen to take solely onto their own shoulders the decisions that were falling to be made, although I always accepted that the final accountability and responsibility as First Minister lay with me. So I respectfully don't think the characterisation of that is accurate at all. And I think if you were to look at Cabinet, forgive me, there was a Cabinet minute discussed with Mr Swinney yesterday, I think from the 19th of December 2020, where conclusions were put to him similar to that. Decisions are delegated to the First Minister. Looking at only those conclusions would have given the impression that has been given now. But when you look at the minute in its entirety, the previous 2 pages of that narrate the Cabinet discussion, make very clear that Cabinet agreed with the decisions that were being proposed, and that there had been a full and comprehensive discussion. So yes, when we look at paragraphs like that in isolation, I accept that that gives a certain impression that is, I would say, is not accurate, but also would not be the impression given if these minutes are read in their entirety.
You mentioned in your explanation, your helpful explanation, that the process would be that there would be a discussion to ascertain whether Cabinet agreed with the decisions that were proposed. Does that not lead to the conclusion that decisions had already been reached and that Cabinet was in effect a decision ratifying rather than a decision-making body?
No, that's not the case, because in many of these instances, there was not one proposal put forward. Cabinet would have a range of different options. One Cabinet we may come on to talk to later on at a later stage to this, as we go into the latter part, into Christmas of 2021, when Omicron has been identified. That Cabinet has, and I'm using this just as an illustrative example, there will be many others, it has 3 options. Effectively stick with the measures we have in place just now, enhance them in some way, or have a circuit breaker. Cabinet has a full discussion and then it reaches a decision. So it was not always the case that Cabinet simply had a proposal put to it that it could take or leave. Cabinet would have a range of options. The exchange that we talked about before the break between Liz Lloyd and I is reflective of that. There were options that Cabinet would have been chewing over and coming to a balanced view of.
We can judge that ourselves, as you said earlier, from the Cabinet conclusions.
Absolutely, yes.
The gold or gold command meetings, accepting that you don't like the term, that seems to be what they were at least colloquially referred to as. They are somewhat mysterious to us in the sense that they weren't minuted, were they?
There were not minutes taken of them in the way that you have Cabinet minutes. That is certainly the case, because they were not decision-making meetings in the way Cabinet meetings were. However, and I believe, forgive me if I'm misinformed here, I believe the inquiry has papers that went with and around those meetings, slide packs that would inform the discussion, agendas of the issues we were going to discuss, and where there had been actions out of these meetings, usually to do further work to inform decisions, then notes of action points. And I've certainly, the committee, the inquiry, apologies, had asked me to review some of that. So I've reviewed that paperwork, and I know that that is there. But in many of these meetings, the purpose of them was, Cabinet had choices and options, but no Cabinet on any issue, anywhere, sits with a blank sheet of paper. So there is a process of shaping the options that will then become the decisions that Cabinet takes. And these meetings were often to try to shape those options. So in a sense, the output of those meetings, the and I use this term loosely, the minutes of those meetings are the cabinet papers that then go to cabinet for decision, because that is what comes from these meetings into the cabinet papers that then inform and shape the decisions cabinet reaches.
We've certainly had access to certain action points. They don't relate to every Gold meeting. We've struggled rather to work out even when the Gold meetings took place. We have to look at other documents to tell us when they might have happened. We have seen action points, not in relation to all of the meetings that appear to have happened. But the action points appear very much to be effectively the conclusion of the meeting, rather than any discussion as to how those conclusions were reached. Therefore, is it fair to say that the documentation to which you refer does not tell us the salient points that were discussed in the conduct of government business at those meetings?
So I think, yes, I think that would be fair, and there is undoubtedly a learning point for government here, and it is not any longer for me, but I'm sure the Scottish Government will be reflecting on this. I think around the impression that can be created when you give grand names to fairly routine meetings, and I've already made that point, but more substantively, to make sure that there is a clearer record of these discursive, non-decision-making meetings that are discursive and there for the purpose of shaping the decisions that have to be taken by Cabinet. So, yes, I would accept that can, to somebody outside the process, it would be helpful if that was clearer. I can look at Cabinet papers, not minutes, but Cabinet papers, putting the proposals for decision or the options for decision to Cabinet, and I know that that effectively reflects the discussion that we would have had in these meetings, because that was how we shaped the options and decisions that were coming to Cabinet.
Is there a theme developing in the areas we've already looked at, Ms Sturgeon, that the Scottish Government does not like light to be shined on the way in which discussions leading to decisions have taken place?
No, I would very, very strongly refute that. And, this is a point I've made a number of times already this morning, and forgive me for repeating it, but I do think it is extremely important. I have, in preparation for coming here today, and some of these, the committees specifically drawn my attention to, I have looked at all of the Cabinet papers and minutes over that whole period. It runs to thousands of pages, and that paperwork doesn't simply record the decision that was reached. It records the options that Cabinet considered, the pros and cons of each of these options, the reasoning and the evidence that underpinned both the presentation of the options and the decision that was reached. And then the Cabinet minutes, often over several pages, records a very detailed summary of the discussion around the Cabinet table. And I do believe that not only gives a comprehensive record of the decisions that the Scottish Cabinet reached in relation to COVID, but also the thought processes, the reasoning, the rationale, and the factors that were considered in the process of reaching these decisions.
The Gold meetings, as we're calling them, were often attended by Mr Youssef, is that right?
I don't have the attendance list in front of me, but yes,
broadly,
that would have been the case when he was Health Secretary, yes.
And often attended by Ms Lloyd?
There would have been a special advisor in them and officials there and somebody from my private office.
If their position at this inquiry were that the Gold meetings were a decision-making body, would they be wrong about that?
Yes, the Gold meetings were not. Cabinet was the decision-making body.
How was the list of attendees decided? I think you said that Mr Youssef would attend in one role, but perhaps not in another.
It would depend on the nature of the decision that we were about as Cabinet to consider. So that would vary depending on the state, the stage of the pandemic and the state of things that we were dealing with at the time. So sometimes that would be very health focused, particularly later as we go into 2021, when finance to support our public health decisions was becoming more of an issue. That would include finance. I was, again, at the committee's request, reviewing the inquiry, my apologies, request reviewing some of these papers over the course of yesterday. So, for example, at late 2020, there were meetings that Ms Forbes, as I think she said yesterday, wasn't at, but her office was copied in to the notice of the meeting and the papers. The Economy Secretary, Fiona Hislop at the time, was at these meetings. Later in 2021, when finance was much more of an issue, Ms Forbes would be in attendance and perhaps another minister might not be. These were discursive opportunities for us to throw around issues. Well, firstly, to look at the state of the pandemic, the data, what we were dealing with, the choices and the decisions that we were having to take, what the implications of those decisions were, what factors we had to take account of in order that all of the proper work could be done to then shape and inform the decisions that Cabinet would take.
To be clear about Ms Forbes' evidence, her position was that she did not attend any meetings in 2020. In fact, she didn't even know of the existence of the Gold Group in 2020.
That I obviously cannot say what information was shared with her at that time about these meetings with the private office, but having reviewed some of these papers last night, and I will apologise and be corrected if I've read this wrongly, her office was copied into the papers and the notification of meetings at the end of 2020.
But she didn't attend in 2020?
She wasn't in attendance in 2020. I don't think it would be true to say that her office didn't know about these meetings. Had she known, and obviously from her evidence yesterday she didn't know, but had she and had wanted to attend, there would have been nothing to stop her attending. But in those meetings at the end of 2020, I believe that the Economy Secretary was present because at that point, as we've reflected earlier on, issues around hospitality, the impact and the burden on businesses was one of the issues that we were frequently discussing and reflecting on.
These meetings presented discursive opportunities, as you've described them, at which Ms Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, did not participate. Is that correct?
She did not participate in all of the meetings, no.
She didn't participate in any of the meetings in 2020?
I think there were probably only few meetings in the latter part of 2020. I don't have the list in front of me right now, but I believe that these meetings, these gold meetings, started in perhaps September, October 2020. So I don't think there were very many meetings in 2020. She wouldn't, from her evidence yesterday, she wasn't there. She was at meetings in 2021. There was no, this was as I think you're demonstrating in your questioning, it was a reasonably fluid group in order that we had the right people around the table to sort of throw around the issues that we were discussing in order to inform decisions at Cabinet. Of course, Ms Forbes, with all other Cabinet Secretaries, would have been at Cabinet when the actual decisions came to be taken and would have been and did make their views known and contribute fully to those discussions and take part in the decisions.
As she wasn't there, she obviously wasn't one of the right people to have round the table. Was that right?
No, that is, well, she was there when we got into 2021 when finance became more of an issue. That is not the basis on which I operated at any time over my period as First Minister, and certainly not during the pandemic. All I was interested in was having around the table the people that we needed to inform the decisions that we were taking. And when those decisions failed to be taken, all of the Cabinet were there. My only motivation at any point during the pandemic was to do the best we could to keep the country as safe as possible. Sometimes we would have succeeded in that, other times we didn't. And I carry the regret for the occasions that we didn't all the time and always will do. But the motivation was just to try to take the best possible decisions we could.
Could we go to INQ 000346141, please? This is some notes taken by Ms Lloyd. You may recognise the handwriting. From the 28th of September 2020. And in these notes, she says, Gold Command, and she refers to, let's find the page. It's the next page I think I want to look at, if that's okay. Yeah, just the passage at the top, which is obviously in that context. Navigate economy, avoid blunt instrument. FH, no finances. FM, starting point. How do we reduce impact of spread with minimal economic impact? Political tactics, calling for things we can't do to force UK. This is a Gold Command meeting that Ms Forbes was not at. Is that your understanding?
Yes, FH will be Fiona Hislop.
Yes, Ms Hislop was. That's my understanding as well. This is a meeting in which there is a discussion about important financial matters relating to how we would reduce the financial impact of possible restrictions that were being contemplated at that time. Is that correct?
That certainly is how it appears from what's in front of
Again, to contextualise this, just to make sure we're literally on the same page, but my understanding of this period is that this is a period when cases have risen. You made an announcement on the 7th of September that you would have to slow down the easing of the lockdown. There was advice being given in this month by SAGE and others within the Scottish Government as well that there may need to be a circuit breaker. And I think what the context of this discussion, just so we're understanding each other, is that there was consideration of what the economic situation would be if we had another lockdown, in particular whether there would be funding for business and for furlough and that sort of thing. Is that, again, broadly your understanding of this period?
Yes.
We discussed this, I think, with Ms Lloyd, in particular the part where she talks about political tactics calling for things we can't do to force UK. What was the reference there? Do you recall?
Well, this was during a period as we are sort of September through the autumn of 2020, which culminated in the second lockdown in England, enhanced measures in Scotland, but not full lockdown. And it was at that point, it became much more of an issue as we went into 2021. But this was at the point where this issue, which I spoke about very often at the time and which no doubt we'll speak about later today, was starting to come to the fore of a disjoint between the ability of the Scottish Government and the responsibility of the Scottish Government to take public health decisions, but our inability to borrow the money or raise the money to compensate businesses or individuals for the impact of those decisions. When such decisions were taken by the UK Government for England, they could provide the financial support. And this was a frustration that was expressed by us regularly and also by the First Ministers of Wales and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. That is, again, these are not my words, they're not my notes, but we often, not often, that would be putting it too strongly, but this was the start at which we were experiencing a situation where we were not managing to persuade the UK Government privately, and therefore we were having to contemplate airing some of these issues publicly. I
think that did happen, Ms Sturgeon. I think you made an announcement in this regard about what the situation was. In fact, the 1st of November, just a few days after this, which then on the very same day led the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to respond saying that furlough would be available in the event of a further Scottish and indeed Welsh or Northern Irish lockdown.
I don't think we ever, in fact, I'm not sure to this day we ever got the actual pinned down detail of what that meant, whether it would be 80% furlough for as long as a Scottish lockdown lasted, or whether it was just a sweeping statement to...
To be clear, that this wasn't, in fact, it was slightly late. It was the
this was it. This was earlier than that.
Yes, this was September.
I'm just trying to illustrate what this was. It was a time when these frustrations were beginning to surface, which hadn't been there in terms of the financial aspect of this up until now, where, I mean, this was, to be blunt, this was about making sure, the Scottish Government seeking to make sure that if we had to apply tougher restrictions or impose another lockdown, Scottish workers would get their wages paid, Scottish businesses would be compensated for that in the same way that the UK Government would be able to make possible for individuals and businesses in England. And that's what that is, I believe that is what that is referring to. Ms
Forbes told us that prior to and around this time she had been involved in considerable discussions with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury around this and other financial issues. This was a discussion in which she should have participated, is it not?
It may have been. If what is being put to me, and forgive me for if I'm reading into things that are not there, but if what is being put to me is that Ms Forbes was somehow being excluded from discussions that she should have been party to, then that is absolutely not the case. Ms Forbes was an extremely highly valued member of my cabinet, an extremely competent and professional member of my cabinet. If she, any discussion she would have been having with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury would have been properly reported to me and through the government. There were many different meetings at many different levels within the Scottish Government at which different ministers and cabinet secretaries and officials would have participated. Fiona Hislop, and we at that time had a finance secretary and an economy secretary. She was there that day clearly to represent the broader business financial interests. And I'm sure, again, you'll be able to check whether I'm right or wrong on this by reference to the corporate record, is that if there had been issues raised there that required answers or considerations around financial impacts, then Ms Forbes' office would have been contacted and she would have been part of wider discussions. I did not operate on any issue at any point of the COVID pandemic in a way that sought to exclude people from decision making. I tried to lead from the front. I tried to shoulder my fair share, sometimes deliberately more than my fair share of the burden of decision making, given the severity and the difficulty of the decisions that were being made. I thought that was appropriate for a First Minister. Unlike Cabinet Secretaries who have their own portfolios, I also had a responsibility to see the whole picture. But I tried to use the best resources I had available, ministerially and in the civil service, for the Scottish Government in the whole to reach the best decisions. And I absolutely accept that it's the case that we can look at a single note of a single meeting and look at, well, a particular person wasn't at that, and reflect now. So I am sitting here thinking, I don't know why she wasn't there that day, and probably she should have been, but that was not some deliberate attempt to exclude her. On the contrary, she was crucial to the pandemic response in many ways.
Well, we have her evidence on that matter. We've looked at another exchange between Mr Youssef and Professor Leach, actually around the time that Mr Youssef took the role after the election of Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, in which they start to discuss the exposure of Mr Youssef to all the information that he needs to take on board to try to make decisions in his new role. Professor Leach refers, they discussed the possibility or the imminent deep dive meeting that is about to take place, at which they're both going to attend. And Professor Leach suggests, as regards that meeting, that there was some FM keep it small shenanigans, as always. She actually wants none of us. Is that an accurate reflection of the way in which you manage the pandemic in Scotland? No,
it's not, and it couldn't be further from that. Perhaps you have to know Jason Leach as well as I do to fully appreciate his, sometimes turn of phrase. I should say I have got the highest opinion of Professor Leach, and he was crucial in a very, very positive way to our handling of the pandemic. This probably refers to, if it's not, and this wasn't particular to the pandemic, it was probably particular to my First Ministership overall, a bit of a sort of, I don't know how to describe it, almost joke within the government. In government there is a tendency, and again I say this respectfully, I've got the highest regard for the civil service and deep gratitude to the civil service for everything they do, and particularly did during COVID. But when you have any meeting involving ministers, particularly the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, there is a tendency kicks in, everybody wants to be in the room, whether they, strictly speaking, need to be there or not. And you could end up with meetings where there would be literally a cast of thousands of people, many of whom just wanted to be in the room to hear what was said and didn't need to be there. I didn't have a great deal of patience with that. I wanted the right people. By that, I don't mean people, whether I liked them or not. I meant with the right expertise and ability to and experience and knowledge to offer round the table. So that's, I suspect, again, Professor Leach would have to answer what he meant there. I suspect that's a reference to that thing that was said about me in the Scottish Government that I didn't like casts of unnecessary thousands in meetings. I absolutely wanted the people who were critical to making decisions around the table when either decisions were being discussed and shaped, and certainly when they were being taken. And she actually wants none of us. Don't get me wrong, there are days during the pandemic I would gladly not have had to see, Jason or Gregor or Hamza or all of these people. This was an incredibly stressful period for all of us, but I wanted all of the people with the right expertise in the room so that we could take the best decisions we possibly could.
The word shenanigans has the words "as always."
I think I've set out what I think that means. I think it probably shows Professor Leach was not discriminating in the comments, who he chose to make comments about in these discussions.
You gave some previous evidence when you helpfully appeared in Module 1 about your experience, ministerial experience, having been Health Secretary, Deputy First Minister and First Minister. And you told the inquiry about the fact that you had in fact had, I think in your role as Health Minister, experience of dealing with a pandemic before, as you had dealt with Scotland's response to and position in the 2009 H1N1 swine flu crisis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Although her ladyship is still to make determinations on the matter, it was suggested by a number of witnesses in Module 2 that the then Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, was the wrong Prime Minister for this crisis. Did you share that view?
Yes. I'm risking here going further than I should and being reprimanded for sounding political. I'm not meaning to be. I suppose I'm trying to put that into context where I don't think I'm betraying any secrets here when I thought Boris Johnson was the wrong person to be Prime Minister. Full stop. So I think that answer has to be seen within that context.
Did you consider yourself, against that background and your considerable ministerial experience, to be precisely the right First Minister for the job?
No, that's not how I would have thought of it at all. I was the First Minister when the pandemic struck. There's a large part of me wishes that I hadn't been, but I was, and I wanted to be the best First Minister I could be during that period. It's for others to judge the extent to which I succeeded.
Thank you. It's undeniable that you had the previous experience of the H1N1 crisis. That's simply a fact. And that you had considerable experience in dealing with health matters, in particular as you had been Cabinet Secretary for Health. I'd be interested to know, Ms Sturgeon, whether in the juxtaposition between that simple state of affairs and your opinions shared by some others of Mr Johnson, that you saw a political opportunity in the fact that you were well equipped in your mind to deal with the response and he was not?
No. The answer I gave you a moment ago about Boris Johnson, I don't remember thinking that in the moment. I've made the political comment about my views of Boris Johnson generally. In those early days of the pandemic, my view was, and my experience was, that we were all trying our best in almost impossible circumstances. To the next bit of your question, did I see an opportunity? I didn't see an opportunity of any description in COVID. I saw a threat, a risk, a catastrophe. My memories of the early part of 2020 in terms of how I was feeling and thinking and the emotions that I was experiencing was at first fear at what might be about to unfold and confront the country. At times, and I think you've seen snippets of perhaps the sort of human side of being a leader and a politician in these moments. At times in those early days, I felt overwhelmed by the scale of what we were dealing with. And perhaps more than anything, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to do the best I could. And so the idea that in those horrendous days, weeks, I was thinking of a political opportunity, I find, well, it wasn't true.
Was it the case, Ms Sturgeon, that the overwhelming responsibility that you've described feeling manifested itself in you taking a very firm grip over decision-making, difficult decision-making, such that ultimately decisions about the management of the pandemic were made by you?
No. And again, I would say any reading of the Cabinet documents, I think, would show that that is not the case. Decisions were made by my Cabinet. Did I, in those discussions leading to decisions, have views? Of course I did. We've reflected earlier on, I was trying to inform myself, to educate myself. I had a role in Cabinet that, to an extent, the Deputy First Minister had as well, to see the whole picture and not just particular portfolio impacts. But the decisions were taken collectively by Cabinet, and I absolutely maintain that that is what the Cabinet documentation shows. You asked me if, at the start of that, given that overwhelming responsibility, did I take a firm grip of leadership? And I hope I did. I had never experienced, and most people at that time had never experienced, I had been Health Secretary during swine flu, thankfully turned out not to be anything as severe as COVID. I had never experienced this before, and I had a sense of responsibility that as First Minister I had to lead from the front, that I had to take the decisions collegiately, but ultimately have an attitude that said that the buck stopped with me, that I was accountable. So we'll talk about decisions, and have done today, and will do no doubt later on, that are decisions that were probably taken not by me, but by my Cabinet secretaries or ministers. There is no part of me that will ever say, well, that wasn't anything to do with me. I was ultimately accountable and responsible, and that's the only way it could have been, and I tried to do that to the best of my ability.
You've mentioned, Ms Sturgeon, on a number of occasions the very initial stages of the pandemic, and that's what I'd like to turn to next. Just to link it into a matter that you've in fact just been discussing, we've heard some contradictory evidence about the extent to which those who were involved from a scientific perspective in the 2009 swine flu crisis, at the time when information was emerging about the new threat, took that experience to be something of a comfort, based on the fact that, as you've said, it didn't turn out to be as bad as it might well have been in Scotland. And from others that use that experience really almost in completely the opposite way, to lead to the conclusion that the threat was incredibly great. Based on your previous political experience of that and knowledge, which you've told us about in Module 1, to what extent were you able to draw on that experience? And in particular, what advice do you recall having it in the first couple of months, January, February time, about whether that experience should be something from which one should take comfort or something from which one should, in fact, sense considerable alarm?
If I may, there's different parts in that, so
Yes.
if I can try to address all of them. I don't think there was any advice in that early period that said in terms, don't worry, it will just be like swine flu versus, we should be thinking that because it was mild in swine flu, it will be the opposite. I don't think there was advice in those terms. During January and into February 2020, I think I received the first briefing forgive me if I'm not getting my dates absolutely correct here. I think I received the first briefing about swine flu around the 17th of January. I convened the first meeting of the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee, the Scottish Government equivalent of COBRA, I think on the 28th or 29th of January. So from January onwards, there was a distinct and almost on a daily basis growing understanding and apprehension that this was going to be extremely serious. Sometime in February, early February, and I remember this vividly because it was part of that sense of fear and responsibility I spoke about, seeing, reasonable worst-case scenario projections that were terrifying in terms of what could have happened. In terms of going back to swine flu in my own view, this is a question I've asked myself often. Did the experience of swine flu even subliminally influence my attitude in the early days to COVID? It was definitely there. I learned things in relation to swine flu, the communication approach, the daily briefings. The then Chief Medical Officer, Sir Harry Burns, and I did a similar approach in swine flu. So I'd learned about the importance of clear, regular communication, and I was able to draw on that. I don't think I had any sense that because swine flu had turned out to be, to use a loose term, a false alarm, the same was likely to happen with COVID. In fact, I think that because that was in my mind, I think I was guarding against that in those early days. But it's a complex question with perhaps no simple answer. I think there are other things which no doubt we'll come on to in those early days or those early weeks that if I had my time again, I would want to do differently. I think there were assumptions made, for example, around the public's willingness to comply with restrictions and how long that would last that were made by decision makers, myself included, that turned out to be wrong, I think, that perhaps influenced some of those early decisions more than a memory of swine flu did.
Thank you. As I say, we have conflicting evidence about what scientists thought about that. We heard evidence from Professor Nick Finn, who was not actually at Health Protection Scotland as it was at that time, but spoke on behalf of that body and Public Health Scotland in the evidence we heard. He, in his evidence, was one of the witnesses who sought to draw on the H1N1 experience as something of a comfort, given the way it had turned out. Was HPS a body from which you were getting advice about the threats at this time?
Yes, so I referred to the early briefings. They would come either from HPS or, informed by HPS through whatever channel in the Scottish Government. Looking back at swine flu, HPS back then was a body, I was Health Secretary, I was familiar with it anyway, but worked closely with Jim McMenamin, who I know you heard evidence from as well, worked extremely closely with him, and somebody else I have the highest regard for, his expertise and commitment to these issues. So HPS was... Obviously, Public Health Scotland was established at the start of the pandemic, but HPS was a valuable and valued source of advice to me and to the government more widely.
We know that HPS stood up its national incident management team on the 13th of January, so we understand that that was a body that was providing advice at that time to the government. Is that correct as far as you recall?
Yes, so I think the 17th of January was the first time a briefing came to me, but that would have been informed by the I think at that early stage it was, and I think this is reflected in the early advice, it was something of an intelligence gathering operation from what was happening principally in Wuhan, in China, and anything else that was being seen across the world. But that would have been the source of the advice that was coming to me.
You were also quite naturally receiving advice from Dr. Calderwood over this period, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you aware of a series of emails exchanged in late January from the 21st of January, which were sent by Professor Mark Woolhouse, a consultant epidemiologist at Edinburgh University, to Dr. Calderwood, and the contents of those emails? No,
I wasn't aware of them at the time, either of their existence or of their content. I should say my direct contact with Dr. Calderwood in this context would probably have started around the time of the first Scottish Government Resilience meeting at the end of January. So I wasn't aware of the existence or the content of those emails, but having now had the opportunity to read them, certainly as we went from January into February, the tenor and the general content of those emails was certainly percolating through in the information that was coming to government ministers. So I don't read them now and say I had no idea that this was perhaps, not in all of the detail of that, but in the general sense.
So would Professor Woolhouse, the general tenor of Professor Woolhouse, obviously Professor Woolhouse is very much in the camp of, based on previous experience, in particular his experience in dealing with the swine flu crisis and the emerging information, he was very much in the camp of hitting the serious alarm button at that stage. You say that was percolating through? Yeah,
yes, in the sense that as we went through the latter part of January into February, I think Cabinet first discussed this on, if I'm remembering the dates correctly, here on the 4th of February. Now, just to give a sort of accurate picture here, the concern was increasing and mounting as we went through late January into February, and certainly as we got to the end of February into March, it was ever higher. But we had a sense, a very strong sense from the latter part of January that this was something to be very worried about.
We've been through the emails from Professor Woolhouse and with Dr. Calderwood on a number of occasions to look at the detail. I think you've seen those, as you indicated. I don't intend to go to the details, but what I'm interested in is ascertaining what your understanding was of the practical steps which Professor Woolhouse, over and above his detailed epidemiological analysis of things like the R0 and that sort of thing, the practical steps that he was indicating ought to be taken at that stage in order to try to deal with the threat which he had identified. These include the requirement for an integrated surveillance system, various different types of surveillance, including genomic sequencing, isolation, infection control, contact tracing, public messaging, and social distancing.
If I can, these are, and I'm not sitting here notwithstanding having been a minister through 2 pandemics to claim to be an expert on these technical matters, but all of these are things that were built up and developed in Scotland. It will be a matter of judgment for the inquiry as to whether all of these things happened as quickly as they should or could have happened, and we can go into any of these in individual aspects in more detail if you wish me to. But if I take, so we had, and I remember this well from my time as Health Secretary, we had a system of surveillance, the Sentinel surveillance system, which was based on sample testing of respiratory infections across certain GP practices. Some not initially in January or February, but later that was scaled up to cover, I think, more than 1 million of the Scottish population. We very quickly established, from having no ability to carry out COVID tests in Scotland, I think by the 10th of February, we had established COVID test processing facilities in Edinburgh and Glasgow. I think at that early stage, positive tests still had to go to Colindale in London for confirmation, but so over a very short period of time, we had established from no testing capacity to having that, and then that scaled up ever more. Genomic testing, again, an issue we might or might not come on to talk about, the Nike conference. There was genomic study done around the lineage of COVID in that. There was a very substantial study done later on involving genomic sequencing of the importation of COVID to Scotland. So whether we did it quickly enough will be for others to judge, but certainly as we go into the later part of 2020, these capacities are there in Scotland and have been developed and possibly in some cases still developing. Social distancing, of course, came later through the early COBRA decisions. We, started to give advice I think sometime in March, about people being careful about contacts, but the formal COBRA decisions around isolation and distancing came later on in March.
When Ms Freeman gave evidence to the inquiry, she was of the view that Scotland's Public Health Service lacked in staff, facilities and kit to introduce a testing system of the kind that was being introduced, and that the capacity of tests remained at only 350 per day until April. Does this, in your view, based on your involvement and recollection, indicate a lack of urgency in Scotland's response?
So specifically on testing, I would say I don't think it reflected a lack of urgency. I think it reflected the capacity we had in place, and that determined the speed at which we could scale from the very limited capacity to the much greater capacity we had. So if you take testing, for example, the testing facilities that were available pre-pandemic, diagnostic testing facilities, tended to be, not just for COVID, but generally in multiple small-scale labs. While there were expert staff working in these, there was a need to recruit, which is not easy to do with people of the expertise we needed. There was also at that point, and there are different conclusions that can be drawn from this, I appreciate, but at that point there was intense supply chain pressure on swabs and reagents for testing. So I don't think it was a sense of a lack of urgency, but it by necessity, there was a certain limit to how quickly we could go from where we were at the start of the pandemic in testing to where we wanted to do. It took time to put the larger scale labs. That said, the Glasgow Lighthouse lab, which was done through the UK Lighthouse system, I think was open by sometime in April. So things moved relatively quickly. Were they as quick as I would have wanted? Even at the time, and certainly with hindsight, no, but there were practical constraints that we were dealing with at that point.
Had your H1N1 experience of 2009 taught you that early decisive action to contain a viral pandemic would be necessary, and that it would require a testing and tracing capacity? Yes,
and because of what we've already talked about, swine flu and the way it developed or didn't develop, the limited testing and contact tracing that we had in place at that time was much more capable of dealing with the scale of the threat. So yes, it did teach me that. I think there is, and it's certainly a point I have reflected on with hindsight, and I think governments now have to reflect on with foresight, is the level of testing and contact tracing infrastructure that is kept in place outside pandemic periods. It is very costly to do that, but we certainly suffered from not having a greater baseline capacity at the start of 2020 than we had, and we scaled up as quickly as we could. My own view, I'm no longer in a position of responsibility around this. My own view is there should be a greater baseline capacity infrastructure in future, but that comes with costs, and it comes with opportunity costs, and there are obviously issues that governments have to grapple with in that.
The maintenance of that baseline capacity may well be costly, Ms Sturgeon, but I rather suspect that the pandemic itself has shown that Absolutely. It is even more costly not to. So let me be clear, yes, and I want to be clear that I was not suggesting that the financial cost should take priority over the human cost. There were many costs of the COVID pandemic. The human one was the worst of all. So I absolutely agree with that. And Scotland and the UK was not alone in this internationally. Some countries had or appeared to have a greater baseline capacity of testing. I should also say for completeness at this stage, although you'll stop me if it's an area you're going to come on to, testing had limitations. It is absolutely the case that
I think it would have been desirable to have been able to do more testing at an earlier stage. But particularly in people without symptoms, there was not a degree of confidence then. I'm not sure what the degree of confidence is now that the test would pick up the virus in everybody. So we talk about testing. I think it is really important that we understand how central testing is. My personal view is we've also, in doing that, got to be careful we don't blind ourselves to the limitations of testing.
Although there might be limitations related to false negativity in testing, you would have found, would you not, that you would have got more positive tests than the actual situation of not carrying out tests at all?
Oh, self-evidently, yes. The point I'm making is that if I'm at risk of sounding as if I'm arguing against the importance of testing, and I am not, but some of the clinical, which were expressed in some of our decision-making around putting too much reliance on testing, is because of the potential for false negatives. So if somebody does a test one day, it's negative, and then they think, well, I don't have to worry about social distancing or face covering or all of the other protections, then that could, at least hypothetically, have a negative effect. So I think that's more what I was talking about. I am not arguing against the importance of testing, nor am I suggesting that it would not have been advantageous for Scotland in a whole range of ways to have had greater testing capacity at an earlier stage of the pandemic.
One other aspect of the plan, the practical plan that Professor Woolhouse suggested, taps into an area that you've already mentioned. He suggested that there would be a need, it would be extremely important, in fact, in his correspondence, that there would be public messaging. And of course, that was something later on that a strategy was developed for. Were you aware at around this time that there had been a recommendation by a consultant epidemiologist that public messaging, keeping the public informed even at this early stage, was a very important part of the strategy, rather than simply later?
No, I wasn't aware of the content of those emails, so I wouldn't have been aware that that had been a specific recommendation. Although the regular, which became daily public messaging in the form of the daily briefings, didn't start until March, sometime in March 2020. And I'd have to check exactly what the dates were here. I recall, understandably, given that this was becoming a dominant global story, I recall, certainly in advance of that, more regularly being asked questions about it in interviews, so that the public messaging was something that we were aware of and were starting to seek to do, although not in that formal, very structured sense that you refer to, which kicked in later.
We've seen some evidence related to various matters around this period, really up to the first lockdown, where there are matters that are not communicated to the public, and that appears to be broadly on the advice of Dr. Calderwood. I'm thinking in particular around the emergence of the threat and the matters raised by Professor Woolhouse, the threats from the Nike conference and the genomic efforts to try and trace individuals who had been infected as a result of that, the identity of the first person in Scotland to die from COVID in the middle of March, concerns that had been expressed around the rugby international which took place at Murrayfield between Scotland and France on the 8th of March. None of these matters were communicated at that time to the Scottish public with any degree of detail. Is it correct in the first instance that it was on Dr. Calderwood's advice that those matters were not communicated at that time?
I mean, there were different considerations in each.
Yes.
Understandably, these have been grouped together. They
Yes.
all stand individually, and I would have to go.
Of
and
course.
I'm certain you
But
don't want me
the
to go through
simple
them
question was, did Dr.
so
Calderwood provide it?
in the case of Nike and the rugby, yes, I took advice from Dr. Calderwood and discussed that advice with her. I don't think her advice, whatever I might think now with hindsight, that if I was to go back, would I take the same judgment? I may take a different judgment, but I don't think her advice was unreasonable. If I can take Nike perhaps as the instance to illustrate this with, Nike was an event that the Scottish Government hadn't known about before it happened or until after it happened. So it wasn't an event that we had been asked to approve or not approve going ahead. In the first few cases that were associated with that conference, there was an incident management team put in place, led by Health Protection Scotland. It wasn't genomic sequencing that traced individuals. That came later to trace the sublineage and could show what happened with or didn't happen with the spread of the infection. But there was an incident management team that kicked in to do contact tracing, to do everything. And we now know they were very successful in halting any further spread from the, I think, 38 primary and secondary cases that were identified with that conference. The issue...
It's the publication
became whether we put into the public domain at that time that I think it was the second case had been associated with that conference. That was a fine judgment. This was a conference, I think I heard in evidence last week that there was a couple of hundred people at that conference. There wasn't. There were 71 people at that conference. Only 10 of them were from Scotland. And there was a concern that was put to me in the advice from Dr. Calderwood that to say that the case was somebody from that conference would have risked identifying that person because of the small numbers involved. I got that advice. I think I spoke to Dr. Calderwood and I accepted that advice. I don't think it was unreasonable. I heard Dr. Smith say to the inquiry, and I thought this was a reasonable way of putting it, that a different clinician might have had a different risk appetite for patient confidentiality and given different advice. That's not to say that Dr. Calderwood's advice was wrong or unreasonable, but a different clinician might have given different advice, and a different politician might have decided not to accept that advice. And the same politician, going back again, might have decided not to accept it because even though I don't think, when that did surface, I don't think it did undermine confidence in public messaging. I can see now that it had the potential to do that, and I would not have wanted to take that risk. We, of course, know that it didn't lead to any further spread. The final point I want to make about this is this was in early March. On every given day, there were judgments falling to be made, decisions falling to be made, often very fine judgments that could have gone one way or the other. And we were taking these in this unprecedented situation, trying to reach the best decisions we could. I hope the majority of these decisions were the right ones. Some of them, undoubtedly, we would have fallen on the wrong side of that judgment, and perhaps with hindsight, this is one of those. But that doesn't mean it was a decision reached with a motivation of secrecy. There would have been no reason, other than the patient confidentiality, for the Scottish Government not to have said that this was associated with a Nike conference. The reason the decision was reached was on the basis of patient confidentiality. It may have been a judgment we should have taken in the other direction, but that was in the nature of what we were dealing with at the time.
I've put the Nike conference and the lack of publication of it in the context of a number of other things for a reason, which is, would you agree, if it were to be concluded, that over this period, despite the clear indication that had been given by Professor Woolhouse of the need for clear public messaging over this period, that the Scottish Government adopted an approach of secrecy such that it released very little, if any, information about the threat to the people?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. I think, if we're talking about the time period in which the Nike decision was made, which is around the same time period decisions were being made around the Murrayfield rugby match, there was copious amounts of information. I think on the day that I got and accepted advice around the rugby match, we had just published the Four Nations strategy document. We were putting lots of information out there about how we perceived the risk and what we thought the steps that had to be taken were and how that was going to unfold. The decisions that were taken on all of these things were not taken with the intention of being secretive or keeping information away from the public. They were taken on the basis of, in the case of Nike, considerations of patient confidentiality that I accept. Other clinicians, other politicians may have taken a different view on, but they were the genuine considerations that were being taken into account. In the case of the rugby going ahead, that was HPS, gave advice that came to me through Dr Calderwood at the time, that taking it all into account, the fact that it was open air, the fact that there were likely to be supporters that if they weren't going to the match would go into pubs instead because they would all come to Edinburgh, that it was relatively safer for the match to go ahead. These were the decisions we were weighing and arriving at every day. Was every one of these decisions with hindsight the correct one? Absolutely not, but they were being taken in good faith for the best possible reasons and in the best possible way to try to keep people as safe as possible and be as open as possible along the way in that process.
Were the decisions wrong with hindsight?
Would I take, because on Nike, because I saw the potential, I don't think this was the reality. I don't think this risk materialised, but I saw the potential for the Nike conference to emerge later through a media disclosure to undermine confidence. With hindsight, I would have, I think, gone the other way on that. I think the rugby at that point is a more difficult one to call. Again, with all the benefit of hindsight, yes, and within a few days, of course, I was absolutely recommending that mass events should not be going ahead. But this was public health advice that was being given to me by, respected experts, and I accept it, and I take responsibility for accepting it. And yes, on some of these, would I go a different way now? Does that mean they were right versus wrong? These were matters of judgment. There were balanced decisions we were seeking to make for the best possible reasons. We absolutely didn't get all of them right.
Was the first person to die from COVID in Scotland a French national who had been at the rugby?
He was, yes.
No further questions at the moment, my lady, if that's a convenient time.
Certainly. I shall return at 1:45.